The late afternoon sky over Brilliant Grove was a heavy gray, the kind that seemed to smother the light and dull the edges of the day. Officer Tim Walker adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of his patrol car. As he cruised slowly down Oakwood Drive, his eyes flicking from the perfectly manicured lawns to the towering mansions that lined the street. This was the wealthiest neighborhood in town, where the elite retreated behind their high walls and security gates to escape the world's chaos. Tim took pride in keeping this area safe. He'd been on the force for over 20 years, and though he'd seen it all: crime, poverty, violence, this was where he felt most in control. His duty was clear: protect this bubble of perfection from anything that might disturb it. He had a sharp instinct for trouble, and it rarely let him down. As his patrol car rolled down the street, a glint of something unusual caught his eye. Parked at the curb in front of one of the largest estates was a car, a beat-up old sedan with peeling paint and a sagging bumper. It was an eyesore in this neighborhood of luxury SUVs and pristine sports cars. Tim's brow furrowed. Something about it didn't sit right with him. "That car doesn't belong here," he muttered to himself. His suspicion instantly triggered. Tim slowed his patrol car and came to a stop a few yards away from the suspicious vehicle. He sat there for a moment, studying it. The neighborhood was quiet, as usual, no movement except for a few birds darting between the oak trees that lined the street. He considered for a moment that it could belong to a gardener or housekeeper. But something nagged at him. The car was too run down, too out of place even for hired help. His gut told him to investigate further. Stepping out of his cruiser, Tim adjusted his duty belt and casually rested one hand near his holster. His eyes scanned the area as he approached the car. He peered inside, the windows empty, but that didn't ease his mind. In his 20 years on the force, Tim had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something wasn't right. As he was about to return to his cruiser, the front door of the mansion opened. A young man in his early 20s stepped out, carrying a large cardboard box. He wore ratty jeans and a hoodie, his appearance immediately raising Tim's suspicions. He didn't look like anyone who belonged in Brilliant Grove. "Excuse me," Tim called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The young man froze, looking startled. He shifted the box in his arms awkwardly. Yeah, sure," he said, glancing nervously at the patrol car. "What's the problem, officer?" Tim stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "What's your business here?" he asked, his tone demanding. The young man shifted his weight uncomfortably under Tim's gaze. "I'm just helping my aunt move some things," the young man replied, his voice faltering slightly. "She lives here." Tim's eyes narrowed further. He had heard every excuse in the book, and this one didn't sit right with him. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this guy casing the place? Was he a burglar or worse? The idea that someone like him could have a relative in this neighborhood seemed unlikely at best. "Your aunt," Tim said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Mind showing me some ID?" The young man fumbled with the box, trying to set it down while reaching for his wallet. Tim watched closely, already convinced that this kid was up to no good. His hand inched closer to the cuffs on his belt. He'd made his mind up: this guy didn't belong here. Before the young man could produce his ID, Tim's radio crackled to life. "Attention all units, be on the lookout for a silver sedan involved in a shoplifting incident downtown." The dispatcher's voice echoed through the radio. Tim smirked to himself. His instincts had been right, as usual. This car, this kid was trouble. He turned his attention back to the young man, who had now retrieved his wallet and was holding out his ID with a trembling hand. "Set the box down and keep your hands where I can see them," Tim ordered, his tone cold and commanding. The young man's face drained of color. "Officer, I didn't do anything wrong," he protested, his voice shaking. "I'm just helping my aunt. She can vouch for me, I swear." But Tim wasn't listening. In his experience, people like this were always up to no good, especially in neighborhoods like Brilliant Grove. His job was to protect these pristine streets from any potential threat, and in his mind, this kid was exactly that. "You're coming with me," Tim said, reaching for his handcuffs. He felt a grim satisfaction settle over him as he prepared to make the arrest. This was what he signed up for: to keep order, to stop people like this from causing trouble in places where they didn't belong. As Tim cuffed the young man and led him to the patrol car, he glanced back at the mansion, his gaze sweeping over the immaculate front yard and towering facade. For a moment he imagined the headlines if he let this one slip by. It was people like him, hard-working officers who maintained the thin line between chaos and order. He wasn't about to let this neighborhood fall into the wrong hands. What Tim didn't realize was that this small, routine arrest was the beginning of a much larger ordeal. An encounter that would soon unravel his confidence, his judgment, and everything he thought he knew about the world around him. Harriet Richards strolled down Oakwood Drive, her 12-year-old legs moving a little too fast for comfort. Her heart raced with each step, not from exertion, but from a growing sense of panic. The afternoon had started so well. She and her best friend Emma had spent hours playing games, gossiping, and laughing like only kids could, but now, as the shadows of the stately oak trees stretched across the street, Harriet realized she had made a wrong turn. Brilliant Grove's grand houses all looked the same, tall, polished, and imposing. Every corner felt familiar, yet utterly disorienting. Each street seemed to twist and bend in ways that felt impossible to navigate. Harriet had been to Emma's house a few times before, but never alone. Now she was lost in a maze of picture-perfect homes, and each one looked like it could swallow her whole. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand, her fingers trembling as she tried to unlock the screen and pull up the GPS app. But the device seemed as panicked as she was, freezing at every tap and swipe. "Come on," Harriet whispered to herself, her voice small and shaky. "Please work." Her eyes darted around nervously as she stood at the curb, praying that no one would notice her. In a neighborhood like Brilliant Grove, it wasn't unusual to see kids walking around, but she felt out of place today, unfamiliar and exposed. Just then, the sound of an approaching car made Harriet look up. Her heart sank as she recognized the telltale black and white paint of a police cruiser. The car slowed as it neared, and Harriet instinctively clutched her phone tighter, her palms suddenly sweaty. The cruiser came to a stop right beside her. Through the tinted window, Harriet saw the officer inside, his stern face fixed on her. The window rolled down slowly, revealing the hard-set jaw of Officer Tim Walker. "What are you doing here?" Walker demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Harriet felt her throat tighten, her mind scrambling to form a coherent response. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. I'm just trying to get home," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Walker's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening as he looked her over. Harriet could feel his gaze drilling into her, as though he were picking apart her every word and gesture, searching for anything that didn't fit. "This is a private neighborhood," Walker said, his tone thick with suspicion. "Who are you, and what are you really doing here?" "I was just at my friend's house," Harriet explained quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. Emma Stokes. I live on Maple Street. I'm just lost, I swear." But Walker's face remained stony. He didn't believe her. His eyes scanned her over once more, and in his mind, Harriet didn't belong here. She didn't fit the mold of the type of kids who roamed the pristine streets of Brilliant Grove, and to Walker, that was a red flag. "Let me see some ID," he barked. Harriet's heart skipped a beat. "I don't have any ID," she whispered. "I'm only 12. Walker's suspicions deepened. In his mind, her age didn't matter. He was convinced she was up to something. "What's your name, and where do you live?" he demanded, stepping out of his patrol car and towering over her. Harriet's voice trembled as she replied, "My name is Harriet Richards. I live on Maple Street. My dad is James Richards. He's the CEO of Starlight Industries." But before she could finish, Walker cut her off with a cold, dismissive laugh. "James Richards? I know every family in this neighborhood, and there's no Richards living here. Don't lie to me, young lady." Tears welled up in Harriet's eyes as confusion and fear twisted her insides. Why didn't he believe her? She wasn't lying. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But every word she spoke seemed to fall on deaf ears. "Please, officer," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she fought to hold back her tears. "I'm telling the truth. I just need help getting home." But Walker was done listening. In his mind, she was already guilty of something he just didn't know what yet. He reached for his handcuffs, the cold metal glinting in the fading light. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered. "You're coming with me to the station until we figure out what you're really doing here." Harriet's world spun. She couldn't believe this was happening. She was just trying to get home, and now she was being arrested like some kind of criminal. She wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but all she could do was stand frozen in place as Officer Walker closed the cuffs around her small wrists. The next few moments were a blur. Walker led her to the patrol car, his grip tight on her arm. Harriet could feel her heart pounding against her ribcage as he opened the back door and barked, "Get in." Her legs felt like they could collapse beneath her. But she forced herself to move, climbing into the back seat. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. She sat there, trembling, tears streaming silently down her face as the cruiser pulled away from the curb. Through the wire mesh that separated the front and back seats, Harriet watched as her neighborhood disappeared behind her, the familiar home slipping away with every turn of the wheels. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. One minute she was trying to find her way home, and the next she was handcuffed in the back of a police car, being treated like she'd committed some terrible crime. As they drove in silence, Harriet found her voice again. "Please, officer," she said softly, her voice choked with tears. "My dad is James Richards. If you just call him." "That's enough," Walker interrupted, his voice cold and dismissive. "We'll sort this out at the station." Harriet's heart sank even further. She stared out the window, the fear gnawing at her insides. Would her parents even know where she was? Would anyone believe her? All she could do was wait, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. The cruiser pulled into the police station parking lot, and Harriet's stomach twisted with dread. This couldn't be happening. It felt like some horrible dream she couldn't wake up from. Walker opened the door and roughly guided her out of the car, leading her towards the station entrance. Harriet's legs wobbled beneath her as they walked, her mind spiraling into panic. She wanted to scream for help, to run to safety, but all she could do was move forward, step by step, into the cold, unfamiliar darkness of the station. Inside, the bustling activity of the police station swallowed her up. Officers moved about, some chatting, some typing furiously at their desks. But Harriet felt like she was in a different world alone, small and invisible. "What's her name?" the desk sergeant asked gruffly, barely glancing up from his computer. "Harriet Richards," she whispered, her voice trembling. Walker scoffed, shaking his head. "Claims to be the daughter of some CEO," he muttered. "Caught her trespassing in Brilliant Grove." The sergeant raised an eyebrow but said nothing, typing her information into the system. Harriet felt her stomach churn with fear. They didn't believe her. No one did. Meanwhile, across town, Harriet's father, James Richards, was in the middle of an important business meeting when his phone began buzzing insistently on the table in front of him. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he saw multiple missed calls from an unfamiliar number. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just a nuisance call. Excusing himself, James stepped out of the boardroom and returned the call, his mind racing. "Mr. Richards," came the frantic voice on the other end. "This is Melinda, Emma's mom. I'm so sorry to bother you, but Harriet left our house over an hour ago, and she hasn't made it home yet. We're worried sick." James felt his heart stop. His mind reeled as he processed the words. Harriet hadn't made it home? "What do you mean she hasn't made it home?" James asked, his voice tight with fear. "It's only a few blocks." As Melinda explained the situation, James's fear turned into a white-hot rage. His little girl was missing, lost somewhere between her friend's house and their own. Without another word, he hung up and dialed the police station. At that moment, Officer Tim Walker had no idea that the simple arrest of a lost little girl was about to blow up into a full-scale disaster. James Richards wasted no time. After receiving the phone call from Melinda, he stormed out of the boardroom, his face pale with fear but blazing with determination. His driver had barely pulled the car to a stop before James was inside, barking out orders. To the police station now, he shouted, not caring about the concerned look the driver gave him. His hands were trembling, and his heart was racing in his chest. Harriet, his little girl, lost. No, that couldn't be. He had raised her to be smart, careful. She was supposed to be safe in their bubble of a neighborhood. Brilliant Grove was one of the most exclusive communities in the city, a place where kids could play without worry. But now that illusion of safety was shattered. As the car sped through the city streets, James tried to make sense of the situation. Harriet was only 12. How had things gone so wrong? She was just at Emma's house, just a short walk away. How could she have vanished between 2 points so close to each other? Every moment felt like an eternity, and every possibility, no matter how far-fetched, raced through his mind. Back at the police station, Harriet sat on an old, cold metal bench in the corner of the room. Her small wrists, still bruised from the handcuffs, rested on her lap as she stared down at the linoleum floor. The station buzzed with activity, but no one paid her any attention. She felt forgotten, discarded, like she didn't matter at all. Her tears had dried, leaving her eyes red and swollen. She had stopped pleading with Officer Walker after her last desperate attempts fell on deaf ears. The more she had tried to explain, the angrier Walker had become, convinced she was hiding something. Now, she sat there, numb and exhausted, her mind spinning with fear. What if no one came for her? What if this nightmare never ended? Suddenly, the door to the station burst open, slamming against the wall with a loud bang that startled everyone inside. James Richards strode in, his eyes blazing with fury and desperation. He made a beeline straight for the desk sergeant, not caring about the shocked stares of the officers around him. "Where's my daughter?" James demanded, his voice echoing through the station like a thunderclap. The desk sergeant blinked, caught off guard by the intensity of the man before him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down." "Calm down," James roared, slamming his hand down on the counter. My 12-year-old daughter is missing, and I just got a call from her friend's mother saying she's been gone for hours. You tell me to calm down." Before the sergeant could respond, Walker appeared from the back room, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What's going on here?" he asked gruffly. James turned to him, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Are you the one responsible for this?" he snapped, his voice venomous. Walker frowned. "Responsible for what?" "My daughter. Harriet Richards, where is she?" At the mention of Harriet's name, Walker's face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly, his usual arrogance snapping back into place. "Harriet Richards," he said slowly. "That's the girl we brought in for questioning. She was trespassing in Brilliant Grove. She claimed to be your daughter, but—" "She is my daughter," James cut him off, his voice trembling with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Arresting a 12-year-old girl for being lost?" Walker's confidence wavered for a moment, but he stood his ground. She didn't have ID and she couldn't prove who she was. "I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" James spat the word like it was poison. "You handcuffed a child, dragged her to the station, and didn't even bother to check if she was telling the truth. You have no idea who you're dealing with." By now, the whole station had gone quiet. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that this situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Walker, sensing the growing tension, tried to backtrack. "Look, I was just doing my job. She was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" James exploded. "She's 12. She's a child. For God's sake. She wasn't suspicious. She was scared and lost. And you—" He stopped himself, his voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "Where is she?" At that moment, Harriet, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, lifted her head. Her wide, tear-streaked eyes met her father's. "Dad," she whispered, her voice small and fragile. James turned, his heart breaking at the sight of her. He rushed over to her side, kneeling down and wrapping his arms around her in a tight, protective embrace. "Harriet," sweetie, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." "I'm so sorry. I'm here now." Harriet clung to him, her small body shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, nothing else in the world mattered. Not the police, not the station, not even Walker. It was just James and his little girl, finally reunited. But James's anger hadn't subsided. He pulled back slightly, looking Harriet in the eyes. "Did they hurt you?" he asked, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. Harriet shook her head, though the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "No," she whispered, "but they didn't believe me. No one believed me." James's heart twisted at her words, but his rage only grew. He stood up, turning back to Walker with a look that could have melted steel. "This isn't over," he said coldly. "I'm filing a complaint. You're going to answer for this." Walker opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was trapped, caught in the web of his own arrogance. The realization was beginning to dawn on him he had made a terrible mistake. James wasn't just any parent. He was James Richards, one of the most powerful men in the city, and Walker had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. As James led Harriet out of the station, the officers in the room watched in silence, knowing that the fallout from this encounter was going to be severe. They all knew that when someone as influential as James Richards got involved, the consequences could be far-reaching. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. James helped Harriet into the back seat of his car before getting in himself. As they pulled away from the station, Harriet leaned against her father, exhausted but relieved to be safe. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice small and full of guilt. "I didn't mean to get lost." James wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It's not your fault, Harriet," he said softly, kissing the top of her head. "None of this is your fault. I'm going to make sure they pay for what they did." Harriet didn't respond. She was too tired, too drained from the emotional roller coaster of the day. But as she closed her eyes and leaned into her father's warmth, she felt a sense of safety return, a feeling she had feared was lost forever. James, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. His mind raced with thoughts of lawsuits, press conferences, and retribution. Walker would pay for this, and so would the entire department if he had anything to say about it. His little girl had been traumatized, and no one got away with that, not in James Richards' world. As the car sped through the darkening streets, James stared out of the window, his jaw clenched with a mixture of fury and determination. The following morning dawned with a heavy fog that clung to the city like a shroud. James awoke early, the weight of the previous day still pressing down on him. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Harriet, who was still sleeping soundly in her room, cocooned in her favorite blanket. As he moved through the house, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach. The world outside felt different now. It was as if the air was charged with an unseen tension. James made his way to his home office, a sleek, modern room filled with dark wood and glass. He poured himself a cup of strong black coffee and sat at his desk, staring at the pile of papers that had accumulated over the past few weeks. But today, none of that mattered. Today was about Harriet. He pulled out his laptop and opened a blank document, ready to draft a plan. The events of yesterday had ignited a fire in him, and he was determined to take action. He wanted answers, accountability, and most importantly, he wanted to make sure this never happened to another child again. After a few moments of contemplation, he began typing. Gather evidence, call Melinda for a detailed account of Harriet's situation. Gather any recordings or messages that could support their story. Legal counsel, contact his lawyer, Sarah Green, one of the best in the city. He needed someone who understood the stakes and could navigate the murky waters of police misconduct. Media strategy, he needed to think about how to approach the press. James had always known the power of public opinion, and he would use it to his advantage. Community outreach, set up a meeting with the parents in Brilliant Grove to discuss safety protocols. He wanted to ensure that they all knew what had happened and how to prevent it in the future. As he typed, a plan started to take shape. Each bullet point felt like a step toward justice, and with every keystroke he could feel his resolve hardening. He would not let his daughter's trauma be swept under the rug. Just as he hit save, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was Melinda. James, I just heard from one of the officers at the station. They're saying they found Harriet because of a tip-off, she said, her voice shaky. They're trying to spin the story like she was in the wrong. What James exploded, his anger rising once more. They're twisting the narrative? That's absurd. She was a child lost in the neighborhood. They didn't believe her when she said who she was. Exactly. And now they're making it sound like she was wandering around being suspicious. It's infuriating, Melinda replied, her voice tightening with anger. You need to get ahead of this, James. If they're framing it like that, it'll only get worse. James rubbed his temples, frustration mounting. I know. I have a plan in motion. I'll speak to Sarah today. We'll set things right. And I'll ensure the media knows the truth. Good. I'm here for you. Just let me know what you need, she said, her voice softening. And make sure Harriet is okay. Yeah, I'll take care of her. I'll check in later, he replied before hanging up. With a renewed sense of urgency, James dressed quickly and went to check on Harriet. He found her sitting at the kitchen table, a bowl of cereal in front of her. She was poking at the cereal with her spoon, lost in thought. Good morning, sweetheart, he said, trying to keep his tone light. How did you sleep? Harriet shrugged, her eyes downcast. Okay, I guess. James pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Just okay. I had a weird dream. About the police station. They wouldn't let me go, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. James's heart sank. I'm sorry, honey. That must have been really scary. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Why did they treat me like that, Dad? I was just trying to get home. I know, he said, reaching across the table to take her small hand in his. You did nothing wrong. The police should have listened to you. I'm going to make sure this never happens again. I promise. Harriet looked up, her eyes searching his. Are you really going to do something about it? Yes, he said firmly. I'm going to make sure the truth gets out, and you won't have to worry about this again. You're safe now. That's what matters. She gave him a small, hesitant smile, and he felt a flicker of hope. He just needed to protect her, to make sure she felt safe and loved. But he also needed to prepare her for what lay ahead. Harriet, he began gently, I want to talk to you about what happened. I know it's hard, but it's important. Okay, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Can you tell me everything you remember, he asked, squeezing her hand reassuringly. She took a deep breath, her eyes focused on her cereal. I was walking home from Emma's house. It was just supposed to be a short walk, and then I got lost. I took a wrong turn somewhere. Did you see anyone else on your way? James probed, feeling the tension in his chest grow. Just some man. He was standing by a car, and I felt scared when I saw him, she admitted, her voice wavering. I didn't want to talk to him, so I just kept walking. Then I got scared and ran, but I didn't know where to go. James felt a chill run down his spine. A stranger? Did you get a good look at him? Not really. Just his face in the car. It was a dark color, she said, her voice trembling. I thought maybe he would help me, but he just looked. I don't know, creepy. So I kept walking. That's really brave of you, Harriet. You did the right thing by not talking to him, James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And if you see him again, you need to tell me immediately, okay?" She nodded, her expression turning serious. "Okay, Dad." After breakfast, James made the call to Sarah Green, his lawyer. She picked up on the second ring, her voice steady and professional. "James, good to hear from you. What can I do for you today?" "Sarah, I need your help. My daughter was wrongfully detained by the police, and they're trying to spin it like she was in the wrong. I want to take action," he explained, feeling the fire reignite within him. "Of course," she replied, her tone shifting to one of concern. "What exactly happened?" James recounted the events, detailing how Harriet had been treated, and how the officers had refused to listen to her when she claimed who she was. By the time he finished, he could hear the anger simmering in Sarah's voice. "This is unacceptable, James. We have grounds to file a complaint, and I'll help you gather evidence. We can go public with this if necessary," she said, her tone firm. "But I need you to stay calm and focused." "I will," he assured her, his determination strengthening. "I want to make sure no other child has to go through this." "Then let's get started," Sarah said. "I'll meet you at my office in an hour." After hanging up, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a plan, and he was going to execute it with precision. As he turned to head back to the kitchen, he heard Harriet's voice behind him. "Dad," she called softly. "Yes, sweetheart." Do you think they'll believe us?" she asked, her eyes filled with doubt. James knelt down beside her, cupping her chin gently. "I promise you they will. We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth. You're not alone in this, okay?" "Okay," she said, a faint smile breaking through her uncertainty. James stood up, feeling a surge of love for his daughter. She had faced a nightmare, but together, they would find a way to make it right. The battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one he was more than willing to fight. With a final look at his daughter, he stepped out of the house, ready to face the storm that lay ahead. The fog was starting to lift, and with it, James felt a sense of clarity. He wouldn't rest until the truth was known and justice was served. James arrived at Sarah's office, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and determination. The building was a sleek, modern structure in the heart of the city, a far cry from the gritty streets, where he had spent so much time navigating the bureaucratic maze of law enforcement. As he stepped into the lobby, the air was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the low hum of conversations echoing off the glass walls. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves before making his way to the elevator. The ride to the fourth floor felt interminable, each passing second heightening his sense of urgency. When the doors slid open, he found Sarah waiting for him, a determined look on her face. "James, good to see you," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, a reassuring reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. "Thanks for meeting with me on such short notice," he replied, following her into her office. It was spacious and filled with bookshelves crammed with legal texts and case studies. A large window overlooked the bustling city below, the morning sun casting a warm glow across the room. "Of course. Let's get to it. I want to hear everything," Sarah said, motioning for him to take a seat across from her desk. He settled into a leather chair, his heart racing as he recounted the events of the past few days: Harriet's encounter, the police's treatment of her, and the alarming news that they were trying to twist the narrative. As he spoke, he watched Sarah's expression shift from concern to anger. "This is infuriating, James. What they did to your daughter is unacceptable. We can file a formal complaint, but we'll also need to consider our strategy moving forward." James nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "I want to make sure we have everything we need before going public. I don't want to risk Harriet being dragged through the mud again." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. "You're right. We'll need to gather evidence, witness statements, any footage from the area where Harry was found, and we can reach out to Melinda for more information on her interactions with the police. Melinda has been a great support. She knows what happened, and I trust her," James replied, feeling a spark of hope. "I think we need to get the community involved too. If other parents hear what happened to Harriet, they might come forward with their own stories." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed, her tone shifting to one of determination. "A community rallying behind you can be powerful. We need to show the police that this isn't just an isolated incident." Just then, the door swung open, and a young intern walked in, carrying a stack of files. "Excuse me, Miss Green, I've got the case files you requested," she said, handing them over. "Thank you, Emily," Sarah replied, flipping through the documents. "Could you do me a favor and contact Melinda for me? I want to make sure we have her statement as soon as possible." "Sure thing," the intern replied before exiting the office. Turning back to James, Sarah continued, While we gather evidence, we should start drafting a press release. We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of our hands. James felt a rush of adrenaline. I have a few ideas on how to frame it. I want to emphasize Harriet's bravery and how she was treated unfairly by those who were supposed to protect her. Good. Focus on her as a victim, not a perpetrator. This isn't just about her, it's about what's happening in our communities, Sarah urged. Let's highlight the systemic issues at play here. As they began brainstorming ideas for the release, James felt a sense of camaraderie with Sarah. They were allies in this battle, two warriors fighting for the same cause. The hours passed quickly as they delved into the details, their passion fueling the discussion. Okay, I think we have a solid framework, Sarah said. Leaning back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. Let's finalize this and prepare for the next steps. You should also consider reaching out to the media. I can recommend some journalists who have covered similar stories before. James's stomach tightened at the thought. I'm not sure how I feel about going public just yet. What if it backfires? Sarah smiled gently. It's natural to feel apprehensive, but think about Harriet. By sharing her story, you're not just protecting her, you're giving a voice to others who may be afraid to speak up. This could help change things. He took a deep breath, allowing her words to sink in. He could see the bigger picture now. It was about more than just his daughter. It was about creating a safer environment for all children, a community where parents could feel secure. I'm in, he said finally, determination solidifying within him. Let's do it. As they finalized the press release, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. James's thoughts drifted to Harriet, the look of fear on her face, and the promise he had made to protect her. He was determined to keep that promise no matter the cost. The following day, they organized a community meeting at Brilliant Grove Elementary. James sent out flyers and messages through local social media groups, urging parents to come and share their concerns. He knew that the power of their collective voices could be the catalyst for change. On the night of the meeting, the auditorium buzzed with anxious energy. Parents filled the seats, exchanging worried glances as James stood at the front of the room, heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around, recognizing familiar faces: Melinda, who had supported him throughout this ordeal, and others who had experienced similar issues with the police. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I know we're all here because we care deeply about our children's safety. As many of you know, my daughter Harriet had a troubling experience with the police recently. She was treated unfairly, and I can't stand by and let this continue. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. We have to talk about what happened to her and how we can work together to ensure that no child has to go through this again. It's time we take a stand. As he spoke, he felt the energy in the room shift. Parents leaned forward, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Stories began to pour out, tales of misunderstandings, miscommunications, and a growing distrust of the very people who were supposed to keep them safe. James felt a surge of hope as he listened. They were all united by a common goal. As the meeting progressed, he realized that this was more than just about Harriet. It was about creating a community where everyone felt empowered to speak out. James felt a spark of determination ignite within him. They were making progress, but he knew the fight was far from over. As the forum concluded, he joined Melinda and other coalition members outside the building, where they were greeted by a crowd of supporters. Did you see that? Melinda exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. They're finally listening. Yes, but it's just the beginning, James reminded her, glancing back at the town hall. We need to keep the pressure on. This is our chance to push for real policy changes. In the following weeks, the coalition met regularly, brainstorming ideas for their next move. They decided to draft a formal proposal for community policing initiatives, emphasizing the need for training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. They wanted to ensure that the police were held accountable, and that community members felt comfortable engaging with law enforcement. As they worked, James became more involved with local advocacy groups, connecting with others who shared their vision. He attended workshops and training sessions, learning about grassroots organizing and effective communication strategies. Each encounter fueled his passion, and he was eager to bring that knowledge back to the coalition. One evening, while poring over research and articles in his living room, James received a call from Harriet's teacher, Mrs. Thompson. James, I wanted to reach out to you. Harriet has been struggling a bit since the incident, and I think it's important for us to talk. James's heart sank. He had hoped that Harriet was coping better, but he knew the trauma of her experience could linger. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. I'd like to come in and discuss this. The next day, he met with Mrs. Thompson, who shared her observations about Harriet's behavior in class. She seems distracted and a bit withdrawn. I think it might be helpful for her to speak with a counselor or a therapist. James nodded, understanding the importance of addressing Harriet's emotional well-being. I agree. We'll look into getting her the support she needs. That evening, as he sat down with Harriet for dinner, he broached the subject. Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling about school? I talked to Mrs. Thompson today, and she mentioned you might want to talk to someone. Harriet's gaze fell to her plate, a frown creasing her brow. I don't know, Dad. I don't like thinking about that day. I understand, James replied softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. But talking about it could help you feel better. It's okay to be scared, and it's okay to ask for help. After a moment of silence, Harriet looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. What if they don't understand? They will. There are people who want to help you. And you don't have to go through this alone, James reassured her, his heart aching for his daughter. That night, James sat in bed, reflecting on the challenges ahead. He wanted to be a strong advocate for his daughter, but he also needed to ensure she felt safe and supported. The fight for justice and change was essential, but he realized that the emotional healing of Harriet was just as crucial. As the weeks passed, the coalition's proposal for community policing gained momentum. They organized town hall meetings, invited experts to speak, and encouraged community members to share their experiences. The energy in the room was infectious, a palpable sense of unity driving their efforts forward. During one of the meetings, they invited a prominent activist who had experience with police reform to speak. She shared her insights on successful initiatives in other cities and emphasized the importance of community input in shaping policies. We need to be vocal and persistent, she told the crowd, her voice strong and passionate. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with each of us standing up and demanding it. James felt a renewed sense of purpose as he listened to her speak. The coalition had become a force to be reckoned with, a collective voice advocating for justice and change. They were no longer just a group of parents, they were a community united by a common goal. As the movement continued to grow, James found himself grappling with the emotional toll it took on him and his family. The threats he had received lingered in the back of his mind, and he worried about the safety of Harriet and his partner, Laura. But as he looked at Harriet, he felt a sense of hope. She was brave, and so were they all. On a particularly rainy afternoon, James found himself in the backyard with Harriet, watching her play. He marveled at her resilience, her ability to find joy amidst the chaos. Harriet, you're so strong. I want you to know that I'm always here for you, no matter what, he said, ruffling her hair affectionately. I know, Dad, she replied, her smile brightening the gloomy day. I just want things to get better. They will, he promised, feeling the weight of that statement. They were fighting for a better future, not just for Harriet, but for every child in their community. And so as the rain drizzled down, washing away the remnants of the past, James felt ready to face the challenges ahead. Together, they would keep pushing forward, determined to create a safer and more just world for Harriet and all the children they loved. The fight was far from over, but they were armed with hope, courage, and the unbreakable bond of their community. As the coalition continued to gather momentum, James found himself increasingly immersed in the complexities of community organizing. He learned about the nuances of local governance, the importance of building relationships with officials, and how to leverage media attention to amplify their message. Every workshop he attended, every meeting he led, fortified his belief in the power of collective action. Meanwhile, the city council prepared to hold a vote on the proposed changes to policing policies. The atmosphere in the community was charged with anticipation and anxiety. Everyone understood that this was a pivotal moment, one that could either validate their efforts or send them back to the drawing board. James and his fellow coalition members began strategizing on how to make their voices heard at the council meeting. On the day of the vote, James felt a swirl of emotions. He had gathered a group of supporters, including parents, teachers, and even local business owners, to stand alongside him. They arrived at the council chamber, a mixture of determination and apprehension coursing through their veins. As they took their seats, the room filled with community members, all united in their mission. The meeting began with a series of formalities, but the tension was palpable. James glanced around the room, noting the expressions on the faces of the council members. Some appeared sympathetic, while others looked decidedly uncomfortable. Finally, the moment came for public comments. One by one, community members stepped forward to share their experiences. A mother recounted her son's terrifying encounter with the police, while a young man spoke passionately about his desire for change and his hopes for a better relationship with law enforcement. Each story was met with applause, fueling the growing momentum of the coalition. When it was James's turn, he stood up, his heart racing. He cleared his throat and addressed the council, his voice steady. We are not just here to demand change, we are here to create a vision for a safer, more inclusive community. We believe in community policing that prioritizes understanding and cooperation over fear and suspicion. As he spoke, he could see the council members leaning in, some nodding in agreement. This is not just about policies, it's about our children, our families, and our future. We have a responsibility to ensure that every child feels safe walking down the street, and that every parent can trust the police to protect their children, rather than instill fear in them. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and he felt a wave of solidarity wash over him. The voices of the community had risen in unison, echoing their collective call for change. After the public comments, the council deliberated, and the atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. James held his breath as the council members exchanged murmurs and side glances. Finally, the mayor called for a vote. One by one, the council members announced their decisions, and the room was filled with an almost electric tension. The mayor raised his hand and declared, "The motion passes." A wave of emotion swept through the crowd, an eruption of cheers and applause ringing out as community members embraced one another. They had done it, they had made their voices heard. Yet amidst the celebrations, James felt a twinge of caution. This victory was just the beginning. They would need to hold the city accountable to ensure the new policies were implemented effectively. As the excitement subsided, James gathered his coalition members for an impromptu meeting outside the council chamber. "Today was incredible," he said, his heart swelling with pride. "But now we need to stay vigilant. We have to make sure that the city follows through on these changes. We can't let our momentum die down." The group nodded in agreement, determination etched on their faces. They began discussing ways to monitor the implementation of the new policies, brainstorming ideas for community engagement and accountability measures. James felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were not just advocates for change, they were now stewards of that change. In the weeks that followed, James worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. They organized community forums to educate residents about the new policies, encouraging dialogue between police officers and community members. The police chief, recognizing the shift in the community's attitude, attended several of these forums, attempting to rebuild trust. Harriet, who had been hesitant to engage with the ongoing changes, began to participate as well. Encouraged by her father's passion and the supportive environment, she found her voice in the discussions. She shared her experience with her classmates and even led a small group of students in a project focused on promoting positive interactions between youth and police officers. One evening, while James and Harriet were working on a school project together, she looked up at him, curiosity shining in her eyes. "Dad, do you think the police will really change?" James paused, contemplating her question. "I think change is possible, but it takes time, effort, and commitment from everyone involved. It's not just about new policies, it's about changing mindsets and building relationships." "Do you think I can help with that?" Harriet asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. "Absolutely. Your voice matters, and every little bit helps," James replied, a smile spreading across his face. "You have the power to inspire others, just like you've inspired me." As they worked together, James marveled at how far they had come. The bond between father and daughter had deepened through their shared experiences, and he could see the impact of their advocacy work on Harriet's growth. She was blossoming into a young woman with a strong sense of justice, ready to challenge the status quo. But as they celebrated their progress, James couldn't shake the feeling that there were still challenges ahead. The pushback from those resistant to change was palpable, and he knew they would face obstacles. During a community meeting, he was confronted by a group of residents who were skeptical of the coalition's efforts. By the time the meeting came to a close, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had formed a coalition, a group dedicated to advocating for transparency and accountability in law enforcement. The battle lines were drawn, and together they were prepared to fight for justice, not just for Harriet, but for every child in their community. As they left the auditorium, a sense of solidarity filled the air. James felt lighter, as if the burden he had been carrying was finally beginning to lift. With each step, he could feel the strength of their collective voices rising, a force that would not be silenced. But deep down, he knew the storm was far from over. The police would not take kindly to their outcry, and he could only imagine the pushback they would face. However, for the first time since Harriet's ordeal began, James felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would forge a path toward justice, and he would protect his daughter at all costs. The following week felt like an eternity for James. He and the community coalition had spent countless hours strategizing and organizing their next steps. They had drafted a formal letter detailing Harriet's experience and the concerns that had arisen within the community regarding police conduct. The plan was to present it to the city council during the upcoming meeting, where they hoped to garner enough support to demand accountability. The morning of the city council meeting arrived, and James felt a mix of excitement and dread. The air was thick with anticipation as he stood outside the council chamber, flanked by a small but determined group of parents. Melinda, who had become a close ally, was by his side, holding a stack of printed letters ready to distribute. "Remember, James, speak from your heart," she encouraged him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This is about Harriet and all the kids who deserve to be treated with respect." "Yeah, I know. I just hope they listen," he replied, his stomach churning. As the doors swung open, James led the way into the chamber. The room was larger than he had imagined, with rows of seats filled with city officials, media personnel, and concerned citizens. The atmosphere buzzed with murmurs, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Taking a deep breath, James stepped up to the podium, his palms sweaty against the edges. He cleared his throat, scanning the room. "Good evening, everyone. My name is James Carter, and I'm here to talk about my daughter, Harriet, and the issues we're facing in our community regarding police interactions." As he spoke, he recounted the events that had transpired since Harriet's encounter with the police. He detailed her fear, the way she had been treated, and the systemic issues that had come to light through their coalition meetings. With each word, he felt a surge of confidence. This wasn't just his battle, it was a fight for every family who felt unheard. "Harriet deserves to feel safe in our community. We all deserve to feel safe," he continued, his voice rising with passion. "But how can we do that when those sworn to protect us are failing to do their jobs? We need transparency, we need accountability, and we need change." The council members listened attentively, some exchanging glances, others jotting down notes. James could see a few parents in the audience nodding in agreement, their faces a mixture of anger and determination. He had their attention, and he was determined not to waste it. "I urge you to take our concerns seriously. We want to work with you to find solutions that prioritize the safety and well-being of our children," he concluded, his heart racing. "We cannot stand idly by while our kids are subjected to fear and mistrust." As he stepped away from the podium, a wave of relief washed over him. The hardest part was over, but he knew they still had a long way to go. Melinda stepped up next, sharing her own experiences and calling on others in the community to come forward. One by one, more parents followed, recounting their own stories of frustration and fear. After several emotional testimonies, the council members began to deliberate. James and the coalition watched anxiously as the mayor addressed the crowd. "We hear your concerns. We understand that there are issues we need to address within our police department. I assure you that we will look into this matter seriously." But James wasn't convinced. Look into it wasn't enough. The community needed action, not just promises. As the meeting concluded, he turned to Melinda, a determined glint in his eye. "We need to keep the pressure on. This is just the beginning." "Agreed," Melinda replied, her face resolute. "We should start planning another rally. We need to make sure our voices are heard loud and clear." Over the next few days, James and the coalition organized a rally outside the city hall. They created signs demanding justice for Harriet and for other children who had been treated unfairly by the police. The event drew attention both locally and on social media as news of the coalition's efforts spread. On the day of the rally, the atmosphere was electric. James stood at the front, his heart swelling with pride as he looked out at the sea of parents, children, and supporters holding signs that read "Justice for Harriet" and "Protect our kids." As they marched through the streets, chanting and sharing their stories, James felt a sense of camaraderie he hadn't experienced before. The community was rallying around a cause that transcended individual grievances. It was about fighting for the rights and safety of all children. When they reached the steps of City Hall, James took to the podium once again, this time joined by other coalition members. The crowd cheered as he raised his voice. "We are not going away. We will continue to stand up for our children until we see real change. This is not just about Harriet, this is about every child in our community." The cheers intensified, echoing off the City Hall walls. The energy was palpable, and for the first time, James felt like they were truly making a difference. He saw reporters capturing the moment, their cameras flashing as they documented the rally. As the rally continued, James spotted Sarah among the crowd, her presence a reminder of the support they had built together. She had been instrumental in helping them navigate the legal complexities, and he appreciated her guidance. After the rally, Sarah approached him, a proud smile on her face. "You did amazing, James. The turnout was incredible, and the media coverage is going to amplify your message even more." "Thanks, Sarah. I just hope this leads to something meaningful," he replied, a hint of uncertainty creeping back in. "What if they don't take us seriously?" "They will," she assured him. "The community's behind you, and the media attention means the pressure is on. You're shining a light on an important issue." As the weeks passed, The momentum of their movement began to attract the attention of local news outlets and even some regional ones. Interviews were conducted, articles were published, and discussions about police reform started circulating in the community. James received messages from parents across the city, sharing their own stories of concern and encouraging him to keep pushing forward. But not everyone was supportive. James began to receive anonymous threats, warning him to back off and stop stirring trouble. The messages were unsettling, but they only fueled his determination. He knew he was on the right path, and the fight for justice was never easy. One night, as he sat at the kitchen table going over some paperwork, Harriet entered the room, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Daddy, are we going to make sure the police don't hurt anyone else?" James looked up, his heart aching at her innocence. "Yes, sweetie. That's exactly what we're trying to do. We want to make sure that every child feels safe, just like you should." She nodded, a small smile appearing on her face. "Good. I don't want anyone to be scared like I was." Her words resonated deep within him, reaffirming his purpose. He would not let fear dictate their lives. Together with the coalition, he would fight for change until they achieved the safety and respect every child deserved. As the fight for justice continued, James knew they had sparked something bigger than themselves. The storm was brewing, and while it would be a long and challenging road ahead, he felt ready to face whatever obstacles lay in their path. Together, they would unravel the truth and create a safer future for their children. As the days turned into weeks, the movement began to gain traction beyond the local community. The media coverage had put pressure on the city council, prompting them to schedule a public forum to discuss police policies and community safety. James felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as the date approached. This was a chance for the community to voice their concerns directly to those in power, but the stakes felt higher than ever. The day of the forum arrived and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The community gathered once again, filling the town hall with a diverse crowd of supporters, parents, and activists. James stood among them, feeling the weight of their collective hopes resting on his shoulders. The room buzzed with conversations, and he could see familiar faces, all equally determined to fight for justice. As the meeting began, city officials took their places at the front, including the mayor and the police chief. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of hope and skepticism hanging in the air. James took a deep breath, preparing himself to speak once more. The mayor opened the forum, expressing gratitude for the community's engagement. "It's important for us to listen to your concerns and work together to find solutions. We understand that there have been issues that need addressing, and we want to ensure everyone feels safe in our community." James felt a flicker of hope at the mayor's words, but he knew they needed more than platitudes. After the initial speeches, community members began to share their stories. One after another, parents took to the podium, recounting their own experiences with police interaction, stories filled with fear, confusion, and a longing for change. When it was James's turn, he stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding. "Thank you for allowing us to speak today. My name is James Carter, and I'm here not just for my daughter, Harriet, but for every child who deserves to feel safe in our community." He spoke passionately about the need for accountability, emphasizing that the police must prioritize community engagement and transparency. "We need our police to be our partners, not our adversaries. There are too many children living in fear of those who are supposed to protect them." As he finished, the audience erupted in applause, a wave of support washing over him. But as he stepped back, he noticed the police chief's expression, disdain mixed with defensiveness. It was clear that not everyone was receptive to their demands. After the forum, James caught a glimpse of the police chief speaking to the mayor, their conversation heated. Curiosity piqued, he edged closer to hear snippets of their discussion. This is getting out of hand," the police chief said, frustration evident in his voice. "We need to maintain order, not create chaos." "We have to listen to the community," the mayor replied firmly. "They're asking for change, and we have a responsibility to address their concerns."
What makes you think the police will change? They've always been the same. One man challenged, his arms crossed defiantly. James took a deep breath, responding calmly. "Change is difficult, but it's necessary. If we don't advocate for a better relationship, nothing will ever improve. We have to believe that transformation is possible." Young men scoffed at several community members not in agreement, showcasing the division within the room. James recognized that not everyone would be on board, but he remained committed to building bridges even in the face of adversity. As the movement grew, James found himself invited to speak at various events, sharing their story and advocating for community-driven change. Each opportunity allowed him to connect with others who had faced similar struggles, building a network of allies committed to reform. After a particularly inspiring event, James returned home to find Harriet waiting for him with excitement in her eyes. "Dad, you'll never guess what happened. My friends want to start a club at school to talk about community safety and how we can help." James beamed with pride. "That's amazing, Harriet. You're leading the way. Can you help us with ideas?" she asked eagerly, her enthusiasm contagious. "Of course, we can brainstorm together. This is your chance to make a real impact," he encouraged, feeling grateful for the fire she had ignited within her peers. As they began planning for the club, James felt a profound sense of hope. The movement ignited a spark in the community, and with each passing day, that flame grew brighter. They were not just advocating for change, they were nurturing a generation of young leaders ready to take up the mantle. But deep down, James knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. They had made significant strides, but the road to lasting change would require resilience, determination, and the unwavering support of the community. And together, they would continue to push for a brighter future, one built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. As they sat together, dreaming of a better tomorrow, James realized that this was not just about fighting against injustice, it was about fostering a community where everyone, especially children like Harriet, could thrive. It was ongoing, but with each small victory, they were rewriting the narrative of their community, one hopeful chapter at a time. As the weeks turned into months, the coalition's efforts began to reshape the narrative within the community. James felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere as more residents began engaging in discussions about safety, justice, and the role of policing in their lives. Leading her school club, conversations about community safety were no longer relegated to hushed tones or fleeting whispers. They were becoming a rallying cry for change. On Saturday morning, James and Harriet set out to visit the local farmers' market, a bustling hub of community life. As they strolled past stalls filled with fresh produce and handmade crafts, they noticed a gathering near the community center. Curious, they approached the crowd, which was assembled for a forum organized by the coalition. It was set to address the recent changes in policing policies and how the community could further engage in the process. Local leaders, including the police chief and various council members, were present, ready to hear the voices of the community. James felt a surge of pride as he watched Harriet mingle with her friends, enthusiastically discussing the importance of the forum. Once the meeting began, the police chief took the stage, addressing the community with an air of seriousness. "I want to thank you all for being here today. Your voices matter, and they have shaped the changes we've begun to implement. However, I know that there's still a long way to go." The chief spoke about the importance of transparency and accountability in policing, and James could see the coalition members nodding in agreement. They had worked hard to get to this point, and it felt validating to see their efforts recognized. As the floor opened for questions, James couldn't resist raising his hand. "Thank you for your words, Chief. Can you explain how the department plans to measure the success of these new policies and ensure community feedback is taken seriously?" The chief paused, clearly considering the question. We're working on establishing a community advisory board, which will include representatives from various community groups. This board will meet regularly to discuss concerns and feedback. Additionally, we'll conduct community surveys to assess the effectiveness of our new strategies. And felt a flicker of hope, but knew they needed to ensure these plans were executed effectively. As the forum continued, Harriet took the microphone, her voice steady. "I think it's really important that kids and teens are also part of this conversation. We have a lot of ideas about how to make our community safer, and we want to help." The crowd erupted in applause, and James watched, amazed, as Harriet confidently shared her thoughts on creating safe spaces for youth to engage with law enforcement. "I like to have events where kids can meet police officers and talk to them about their experiences. We believe that can help break down barriers," she concluded, her passion radiating through the room. After the forum, James approached Harriet with a mix of pride and admiration. "You were incredible up there. I'm so proud of you for speaking out." "Thanks, Dad. I really believe we can make a difference," she replied, her determination. As they sat together planning future events for Harriet's club, James felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Their efforts had not only begun to reshape community relations, but had also inspired a new generation to become advocates for change. However, the tension in the air was palpable. There were still factions within the community resistant to the changes. Some residents felt that the police department's commitment to reform was a mere facade, while others feared that the new policies would compromise their safety. James understood that the road ahead would not be easy. And in the following weeks, tensions flared as protests erupted in neighboring cities, fueled by incidents of police violence that reignited public outrage. James and the coalition members knew they had to remain vigilant and proactive in their efforts to engage with the community and address concerns. They organized workshops to educate residents about their rights, emphasizing the importance of knowing how to navigate encounters with law enforcement safely. In one such workshop, a local activist named Mia spoke passionately about the need for solidarity. We need to amplify our voices and support each other, especially in times of crisis. Change isn't just about policy, it's about creating a culture of accountability and care within our community. James felt a wave of inspiration wash over him as the room buzzed with agreement. They decided to plan a community safety day, an event designed to bring together residents, police officers, and local leaders to foster open dialogue and build trust. As the date approached, excitement filled the air. The safety day would feature activities like a community potluck, games for kids, and discussions on safety and justice. Adams knew that creating a space where everyone felt welcome would be vital in breaking down the barriers that had long divided them. On the day of the event, the park was transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Children ran around playing games while adults mingled and shared stories over delicious food. James watched as community members and police officers engaged in conversations, sharing laughter and stories that humanized the faces behind the badges. It's a booth for our school club, inviting kids to write down their ideas for improving community safety. As she gathered their thoughts, James felt a surge of pride, watching her lead with such passion. Toward the end of the day, James took to the stage to thank everyone for their participation. Today has shown us that we can come together as a community, that we can share our experiences, and that we can work toward a better future. This is just the beginning. As he spoke, James noticed a group of skeptical residents watching from a distance. He remembered the doubts they had expressed in earlier meetings. Inspired by the day's events, he decided to reach out to them after his speech. I appreciate you being here today. What do you think, he asked, trying to gauge their feelings. The young man, still wearing a skeptical expression, replied, I don't know, man, it feels too good to be true. How can we be sure this isn't just a show? James nodded, understanding the frustration. I get it, change takes time and trust is hard to earn. But the only way to move forward is to engage with each other. We need your voice in this conversation. I hesitated before nodding slightly, as if considering James's words. Maybe, but we'll need to see real results. As the event concluded, James felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They had made significant strides, but he knew the journey ahead would be filled with challenges. Community relationships wouldn't change overnight, and there would be setbacks along the way. Back at home, as James tucked Harriet into bed, he couldn't help but reflect on their journey. You know, Harriet, you're doing something really special. You're not just talking about change, you're helping to create it. I hope so, Dad, she replied, yawning. I just want everyone to feel safe. James smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. And you're doing your part to make that happen. I'm proud of you, kiddo. As he turned off the light, James felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead was long, but they would navigate it together, father and daughter, community advocates and allies, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in their quest for justice, understanding, and change. And they had already begun to shift the narrative in their community. And with each step forward, they were forging a path toward a brighter future for everyone. And in the weeks that followed the Community Safety Day, the energy within the town was palpable. The conversations that had once simmered beneath the surface began to rise to the forefront, becoming a steady hum of engagement and activism. James noticed more people attending city council meetings, sharing their concerns and ideas about community safety and police accountability. It felt like a new chapter was being written, one where the community was not just passive observers but active participants in shaping their future. Inspired by the success of a safety day, organized a series of follow-up events through her school club. She invited local leaders, including the police chief and city council members, to engage directly with students. The goal was to give young people a voice in the discussions that impacted their lives. Harriet was determined to ensure that the youth were not only heard but also empowered to advocate for their needs. One rainy afternoon, Harriet stood before her classmates in the school auditorium, nervously gripping the edges of the podium. She was about to present her idea for a youth advocacy summit, a day dedicated to discussing issues important to young people, particularly around safety and community relations. She cleared her throat, looking out at the sea of faces.